Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining a special webinar which follows the publication of the UK framework document on Friday and forms part of a number of initiatives this month where we will talk about the restart and the next steps for the cruise industry. And we've assembled this morning three real heavyweights from the cruise industry who have been part of that formation of the framework document, both in the UK and further afield. And they are Darr, the Executive Vice President, Maritime Policy and Government Affairs at MSC Group, Dingle, the Chairman of Carnival UK, who's with us, although his camera isn't working yet this morning, and Stuart, Leven, the Vice President, Government Relations for Royal Caribbean Group. And as you can see, this morning is moderated by the fabulous Lucy Huxley from Travel Weekly, who I will hand over to now. Lucy.
Thank you very much, Andy. Good morning, gentlemen, and good morning to everybody who's joined us this morning. So now, as Andy just said, the document was published on Friday. It's a very important document, but I think it'd be great if we could understand from you guys why that is. So Stuart, if I may come to you, and if you could explain who is behind this. It was a big collaboration with lots of organisations, but perhaps explain that first of all.
Sure, Lucy. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, we've been working on the document for several months now. It's been in collaboration with the cruise lines, with Clia. From the government side, we've had Department from Transport, Public Health England, the advisory body, the Maritime and Coastal Agency, Foreign Commonwealth and Development, and we've also had the devolved administrations involved in it as well, and that's all come together into three framework documents that have been collated and published by the UK Chamber of Shipping. The three documents covering what passengers should do when cruising recommences, what operators should do when cruising recommences, and also one for our seafarers, for our crew, so we understand the protocols behind our crew joining the ship safely and then being able to operate. Okay,
and this is a government-backed document, isn't it? It's been signed off by the Department of Transport. And why is that so important?
It's the first step on a journey, Lucy. If you look at our overall objective here, the overall objective is to get the relaxation in the Foreign, the Commonwealth and Development Office advice that currently says there's an advisory against people going on cruise ships, UK nationals going on cruise ships. So that's the ultimate objective here. We know we can operate safely in the era that we're operating in. There will be a time not too long in the distance when we will start operating again, but one of the steps along that is government endorsement of protocols and the way that we've gone about this as an industry, as a vote of confidence more than anything, so that we can work together towards having the advice relaxed.
Okay, so let's just be clear. This is not like a signal that cruising can restart, because we don't want people to get confused. It's not restarting immediately, but it is a really insignificant step forward.
It's a step forward on the journey, but it's a significant step forward because it culminates in several months worth of work from the industry and also from government working together to come up with these framework documents.
Okay, and then why, Bud, I will come to you in a second because we want to talk about your experience, but just before we leave you, Stuart, why is this so important? And what does it mean for cruise lines? What do they have to do now? They read this document, but it's up to them to interpret it in terms of their own operations. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a framework document. It's an advisory document, and it's linked very closely to the public health information that's going on within the UK across all four devolved nations at this present moment in time. The next stage that happens is each of the cruise lines will put together a risk assessment based on the framework, which will then be presented to government, which will then allow the resumption of cruising from UK ports. And it's probably a really good time to go to Bud, because Bud's the only person on this call with real life experience of actually having gone through this process, obviously with the Italian ports. So I'll pass over to Bud now.
Yeah, okay, that's definitely a good point. So good morning, Bud. Now you've obviously restarted operations in the Mediterranean, as Stuart said. So it'd be really interesting just to first of all get your experience, and then obviously, your interpretation of this document as well, in terms of, will you be changing anything having seen this document, or did your experience feed into the document?
Yeah, maybe and good morning. Maybe I'll take it in reverse order, because the latter is definitely true. Okay. We already had some experience in developing detailed protocols in getting a sense of where governments were headed with their thinking around protecting the public health as well as protecting the people on board our ships. And so we were able to use that experience because we were pretty far along to work within the group of the cruise industry with the UK Chamber and Clia collaborating together with government. So it was a really helpful experience. And also, we worked very closely, as did some of the other lines as well, with development of the EU Healthy Gateways document, which was published in June, and the European Maritime Safety Agency guidance, which was published shortly thereafter in July. And because we had experience with both of those, we found it was really helpful to not have to relearn some of the same lessons we learned as we were developing what we were going to do in Europe. And I very much agree with Stuart. It was very important that we collaborate with government in the UK. And for those that don't know, our operations for our entire fleet are based in the UK. So we actually have a very strong presence there and a close connection to the UK community. But our experience had been, it was really almost unthinkable that we would begin operating in the Mediterranean where we had planned to without close collaboration with the authorities at the national level or local level, in most cases both, because you really have to make sure that their thinking and their expectations match up with what it is that you're planning to do as a cruise line. So we did have the advantage of being pretty far along in our thinking, and we now have just started week 8 of MSC Grandiosa sailing in the Mediterranean, and we found that the protocols are really working as intended, and where we've had safety nets there to catch problems that came up, they work the way they were supposed to work, and that's actually quite gratifying to see. And then also the fact that we can share that experience through an industry body as effective as Clia is, I think is really good for all of us, because we're an industry where, quite honestly, we compete on a commercial basis, but when it comes to safety, health, environment, security, when one of us cuts, we all bleed as an entire community. So I think that collaboration is extremely important, and I think that the finalization and publication of these documents through the UK Chamber is a great reflection of that spirit of cooperation, and I hope it continues. And I know that if we do this the right way and we do it together, pulling the same direction, that we're going to be not just back, we're going to be back better than ever, and a more longer term sustainable business for the long term. It's just a steep hill to get back to where we were, but we're climbing that hill, and we're going to do it, and we're going to be successful.
Okay. Now you mentioned Bud, you put these safety nets in place, to use your words, and that they were successful in picking up things. So perhaps you could just talk practically about what those safety nets are. Are you referring to screening processes at embarkation? Are you referring to basic things like having key ports of call identified in case there's an outbreak? All these different things that are set out in the framework document. Perhaps you can explain practically what you put in place.
Sure, and you hit on one very big one, because I think of all the preventive steps that we took. For us, the most significant decision we came to early on is that we knew we wanted to do universal screening of guests. That's not an easy thing to accomplish in some places, and we had to work at it really hard to find the right balance between developing technology and reliability in it, and its availability in a practical sense. Particularly if you're bringing on a significant number of people in a particular port. So we did have instances where we had people test positive through our screening process. Most of them turned out to be false positives, but our secondary screening process that occurred after that cleared those that were false positives and did identify a couple that were actual positives, and we were able to keep them from getting on board the ship. Another example I'll give you is the bubble shore excursions, as we call them colloquially. I think that that's a really important element of the way we approach this, because if we were to allow just the routine past experience of you get off the ship and you can take a shore excursion, or you can go to a cafe, or you can just walk around, that really is not compatible with the type of secure environment that we're trying to provide for the guests from start to finish of the cruise. So we saw that as potentially opening up a big gap in those safety nets if we didn't provide that sanitized environment. Say that not meaning a pun, but a safe and secure environment that parallels what we're providing on the ship. And we had 3 guests on our very first cruise that decided that they would create their own shore excursion and break off from their group. Against strong warnings not to do that and that there would be serious consequences. We found them, we tracked them down, we gave them private transportation back to the dock where they found their bags waiting for them on the dock, and they were invited to not come back on our ship again. You hate to lose a customer, you particularly hate to lose one on bad terms, but it had to be done, and it had to be done in a very visible way to show people we were serious. And the response from our guests, the response from the cruise community, and the response from the media was overwhelmingly positive that we really were showing that we were walking the walk and not just talking the talk.
Subsequently, so you really will take a hard line if people are not following this guidance, then this framework document.
Absolutely, and honestly, especially when you're out in front early, as we have made the decision to do, it's not just our guests and our crew and our brand, it's the entire industry that potentially has consequences if we don't do this the right way. So we thought it was really important to say what we were going to do, to make clear we were going to do it, and then when the time comes, actually execute on it. Keeping up that execution in the longer term is going to be a challenge for all of us, because we can't get complacent. It's not a time for that, and so we're continually training and also revising as necessary our procedures and fine-tuning them.
Yeah, so you're setting an example, as you say. Stuart, for the UK though, and obviously Bud talks about what he's doing, particularly in Italian ports. For the UK, I know one of the guidance in the document is around there'll be no disembarking in countries which are not on the UK's travel corridor list. Well, there's not many countries on that list. So what does that mean? Like when there is a restart, will we just see ships sailing to nowhere?
I think it's good. Bud used a great word there, which is bubble. Okay, and I think it's good, Lucy, if you understand, how the framework actually works in its totality. So, first thing we have to do is create a bubble so that the virus doesn't make its way onto the ship. And there's a whole load of measures around testing, around screening, around different. Oh, David's here. Excellent. Around testing, around screening, around communication through travel agents to guests before they get on. Then it's protecting the bubble on board the ship and the mitigation actions we take to protect the bubble on board the ship. And that could be social distancing, that could be hand washing, it could be use of masks, it could be the air quality in the ship, use of technology, and you want to protect that bubble. So Bud gave a great example of the protection of that bubble in a port where someone didn't follow the bubble protocols within the port, so they weren't allowed, back onto the ship. That's no different for destinations, yeah? So that's absolutely no different for destinations. If there's a destination that the UK government deems is not a place that's safe to travel because of COVID at this present moment in time, then the ship should not go to that destination. If it is not on the list, when the ship does go to the destination, you need to make sure you have the protocols in place so that the guests can have a safe experience there. And when the guests come back onto the ship, they're coming back onto the ship in a safe way and creating that safe bubble on board the ship again. I think who knows where we're going to be when we restart and when we recommence. One of the things we have talked about is a phased restart. So I think early as we come back into operation, you may see some cruises to nowhere as we test protocols and we try out protocols. You may then see some cruises just within the common travel area around the UK. You may see some cruises on a bilateral basis, just going to one destination and then coming back again. And then you may see, and then you will see the resumption of the types of cruises that we know, where we've got guests going on, longer cruises, going to multi-destinations. So, but it will happen over time and it will be phased. And, the one thing I will say, the great thing about our industry is we can point our ships in any direction we want to. So if we set off on an itinerary and it turns out there's a problem on that itinerary, we always have an option.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, if I may just add one thing, just to follow up on what Stuart said. I don't want to give the impression that it's just Italy that we're working with, because the cruise that we started with MSC Grandiosa involves Malta as well. And the next the next cruise that will begin operating on our second ship will also involve Greece. So there's a real, detailed exercise to actually work with all those authorities, including at the local level in every port we were going to call. But it was well worth it because in the end they were quite comfortable. And as many probably know, Germany is also, has their own system where you can operate there too. But although they approach it differently than the Southern Europeans did.
Sorry, Bob, but these are ports of call, these other countries. They're not going to be where you're embarking and disembarking passengers to start on the beginning of their cruise.
Yeah, Lucy, in our model, all of the passengers are embarking and disembarking in Italy. You're correct. And
so that's where you've got your screening set up. You don't need that in these other countries.
Correct. We do have some screening capability that we bring with us, but
right.
the large scale, you're correct, is just in the Italian ports. And we do interport. So, for example, Grandiosa has 4 different embarkation ports, which makes things a little more complex on one level, but on another level, you're dealing with fewer people in the terminal at a time as you get used to these new protocols.
Okay, all right, that's really interesting. Thank you. David, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can certainly hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So let's come to you. Obviously, as Chairman of Carnival UK, be really interested to know how you are as a cruise line, and obviously a very important cruise lines for the UK market. How are you interpreting this framework document, and what does it mean for your business?
Well, I think you've heard already from Bud and Stuart, well, particularly from Bud, how the framework is actually being implemented. And, for us, like everybody, number one, it is extremely important, because if this goes wrong, then, our reputation is called into question, our ability to be able to manage this virus. So we take it incredibly seriously. I think there's a really good point to be made, for instance, following Bud's description of how passengers had to be removed from the ship because they hadn't followed the rules. And whilst when we're at home, people do take a risk, and they too step outside the rules and the recommendations that the government has imposed. This can't happen on a cruise. We absolutely have to make sure that people at all times are helping us and helping themselves by following the framework and the way in which each individual cruise line implements that. So I think that's an incredibly important point. So we will need to be very, very strict in the nicest way to make sure that nobody steps outside of those protocols. So for us, it is absolutely critical. It's going to take time, and remember, the guidelines do not give us the license to operate. The crucial thing now is that we have to work particularly with the Foreign Office, with the support of the Department for Transport, to have travel advisory which mitigates against cruising, to have that advisory lifted. And then we are ready to go. There's only a limited amount of preparation that we can do until we know that the advisory is going to be lifted, either in full, which of course would be marvellous, or according to the phased restart that Stuart described. So it's a lot of work to get these protocols in place, and a lot of work to restart the whole of the operation. And then, we need some time after we get an office advisory lifted, fully to prepare ourselves and then get ready to go.
Yeah, and what's the indicate? I mean, you're obviously talking to the Foreign Office. You say you need to have more conversations with them to get this guidance lifted. How are they responding to the industry at the moment? I know it's $1 million question about when will they lift it, but we're in a situation where our own R rate in the UK is rising. There's more restrictions being put on us as a nation. So is that an indication that they're very unlikely to look at cruise, whilst there's other sort of closer to home issues they're dealing with regarding our public health and safety? Or will they still consider the cruise industry restarting, albeit we've got other considerations?
Well, look, I'm not going to place any bets on the likelihood of their saying that we can start immediately or whatever. And I think it's of course rather more challenging, that here we are beginning to issue good news regarding the cruise industry and the acceptance, particularly of the framework, in an environment when we see the R number rising in this country. So you can appreciate the nervousness, and you can appreciate the government's dilemma by not wanting to give out any mixed messages, if you like, regarding coronavirus. So I think that the phased restart and the fact that we can begin by confining operations to the UK and nowhere else, and only carrying British passengers, and effectively just making a cruise an extension of a UK bubble, I think that is a particularly strong argument. And that's certainly one that we would hope to land. Even if we don't get everything at the start, to be able to operate just in those UK waters, I think would be an extremely important signal. Because apart from anything else, it's going to prove the concept of the framework. We will be able to demonstrate that a cruise is, in reality, a very safe holiday to take, just as Bud has been able to do that in the Mediterranean, that we can then do that in the UK. So that's a really important signal. But we do have to, work with the Foreign Office and also with the Public Health England and the Department for Health and Social Care, so that the messages going to the Foreign Office on our behalf are credible and effective, and that they will help the Foreign Office to be able to change its mind. I think one of the issues here, pretty simply, is that no one person wants to take responsibility for the decision. So we've all got to help that process. So we're working really, really hard in trying to persuade all those who can affect this decision to come to our aid and get that decision made as soon as possible.
Okay, great. Now I know we're going to go shortly to questions from people who have joined the webinar, but Stuart, just before we do, I mean, both Bud and David have talked about the importance of people adhering to these guidelines if they're passengers, and you guys having to take a strict approach, but actually people doing the right thing. So that communication is going to be key to passengers, and I guess that will be done via the travel trade, predominantly in the cruise sector. Cruises are sold predominantly by travel agents. So what is your message to agents who will be, reading the fact that this document has come out, this framework, and that they need to sort of pass information on to their customers around, being confident to book a cruise, but then what they would expect of those passengers if they came on a cruise in the new world?
Yeah, Lucy, I think we've all got a role to play in creating these bubbles. And the communication with cruise guests before they actually get on the ship, before they come to the terminal, is a critical part of that. This communication process starts at point of booking. I think within there you've got terms and conditions, you've got insurance, you've got the whole communication process around, if I think for 1 second that I may be at risk of having coronavirus, I really don't want to be traveling to the terminal. So we need to make it easy for the guests not to travel to the terminal in that situation, and the communication has to be quite solid around that. But it's also, there's 3 framework documents, and one of the framework documents is advice for passengers on board, when they get on board the ship. And this covers everything from social distancing to the wearing of masks to, as we've been doing for many years in the ships, washy, handy. It's all that sort of thing. And it's not an overly technical document, but one of the things that we'll ask Andy, and we have asked Andy and the Clia team to do, is turn it into simple language, simple speech, so that in actual fact, if someone comes in to book a cruise, then the travel agency partner, who's got a big, massive role to play in this in terms of building confidence, will have the tools at their disposal to actually sit down and say, right, here's what your cruise holiday is going to look like, but also, so that you can be safe on board the holiday, here's the things that you're going to have to do before you go, and also the thing you're going to have to do after you're on board the ship.
Okay, great. All right. Well, at that point, I think it'd be good to bring Andy back in to so he can pose the questions to you, gentlemen, that are coming from the travel agents. So, Andy.
Yes, thank you very much. And we've had a number of questions in, so please keep them coming. There's a question box on the right-hand side, so please keep them coming. We've got a few comments and a few questions. A comment from Ponant Cruises to say that they have, and this kind of follows up on a point made earlier by Bud, which is that Ponant have been embarking passengers in a number of countries, and there's more planned. So there are an increasing number of countries that are open to embarkation of guests with protocols in place. So a good point. Thank you, Ponant. A question, if the framework has been accepted by UK government, how long would it take the cruise line to get their ships ready to sail? And there was a kind of a similar question around how much crew training has been necessary to get ships sailing. So, Bud, is that a good question for you?
Yeah, realistically speaking, if you've got a ship that's moving from a layup condition to an operational condition, we did have that experience, and we're have it ongoing for our second ship. It takes some significant amount of time because you've got to bring crew members back from their homes, and there's protocols associated with that as well to make sure that they've been screened properly and are ready to go. And then they get to the ship. There's an isolation period on board the ship under our protocol, and then they get tested again before they're cleared to work. So there's necessarily a couple of weeks realistically built into that once you've identified which seafarers you're bringing back. So that's a key part of it. You may have to reposition a ship, which can take a week or so, and some additional maintenance that has to be perhaps done to take the ship out of a warm layup condition to an operational condition, but that's not too extensive. And as far as training goes, it's a very real challenge that we had to face. So we had to develop training at the same time in parallel path as we were developing the protocols, which is kind of like changing the tires on a car while it's driving down the road, but it all came together pretty well. And we used a combination of computer-based training and live training, and then some train the trainer sort of work on our part to make sure that we continue that on an ongoing basis, including drills on board. So you can imagine that takes a little bit of time to get all that together as well. So it's probably not a period of months once the decision has been made, but it's certainly a significant number of weeks at a minimum to have the ship ready to go once you've made that commitment that you're going to run that cruise.
Thank you very much indeed. Question for David. Or does he believe that the UK government decision will follow the decision by CDC in North America?
Well, I think that may have an influence, but obviously there's quite a way to go with the CDC. Would the UK government go ahead before the CDC? I think that is possible, because as we've seen, every government takes a slightly different position regarding coronavirus, and what is going on in the UK in terms of the development of the virus is different from what might be going on in the United States. So I don't think the two are absolutely connected, but I do think that the UK, will be keeping one eye on what is happening on the American side.
Great, thank you. Question for Stuart. What will happen for guests that will, what will need to happen for guests to be able to go ashore independently again? And could it be different rules for different ports depending on the situation in those countries?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah, the cruise lines will be working with all the government supports and destinations to work out what the protocols are, where they arrive, and where they're going into. I think in time we'll get back to a situation with independent guests doing their own thing, but I don't see that in the short term. I think we can all learn from the experiences that MSC and others have had, that if we have this controlled and protected bubble, then we can mitigate the impact that shore excursions are having as people are getting back on board ships. I mean, the one thing to bear in mind though is you do have some private destinations out there, and private destinations in themselves will become protected in private bubbles. So sure, guests going on board to private destinations will be different than turning up in a city and just wandering around, where it really will be shore excursions that are provided by the cruise line and provided in a safe and protected way.
Great, thank you. Question for Bud around ship visits, shore visits for crew. How are you able to manage crew visits to certain destinations during the course of a cruise?
We made a decision early on that a part of our protocol that was presented to the governments where we were operating would be that we would, in the short term, not be allowing crew to take shore leave. Because as you can imagine, if we were concerned about the guests going outside of our bubble type of environment, you invoke a whole lot of extra risk if it's business as usual for the crew members. But that was always just part of our first phase of operation. And as we're moving forward, we're designing shore leave that has protective measures around it that are equivalent to the type of protective measures that the guests are experiencing on the bubble shore excursion. So I think for the short term and maybe the midterm until things loosen up overall with regard to the health condition, that's probably what it's going to look like in our case, because we just really think it evokes too much risk to do otherwise. We are very mindful of the need for shore leave for seafarers. I'm a seafarer myself. I feel it personally, and I know how important it is, but we're in extraordinary times throughout the entire maritime community, not just the cruise industry. And I think most of our seafarers and unions appreciate that this is a temporary situation that we're working to solve in the longer term.
Great, thank you, Bud. I have one more question, then I'll hand back to Lucy. And it's a question around the impact on sailing lengths and also a related question around MSC's plans to come into the UK. So will there be an impact on the sailing lengths initially as restart happens, and also will brands such as MSC start positioning ships back in the UK anytime soon? And then I'll hand back to Lucy. I don't know who wants to take that initially.
Well, if I just make a few comments about durations, and one of the concerns that, for instance, the Foreign Office has had in the UK, and which we've worked very hard with them to, shall we say, modify their view, is any concerns about repatriation of sick passengers or indeed crew members from a ship were there to be any cases on board. And obviously getting people off a ship very, very swiftly depends on where the ship it is at the time, how far it might have gone from the UK. You know, if, for instance, a ship went off and it went continuously across the Atlantic, getting somebody off a ship at that point would take much longer if it was sailing in more coastal areas. In the early stages, it is, I think, highly likely that we will be operating cruises which are, shall we say, closer to ports and to sensible points from which we can repatriate. And indeed, within the framework is the requirement that as part of restarting, the cruise lines identify various ports in various countries where agreements will be made for passengers or crew members from ships to be repatriated home. So all that has to be in place. So I think that certain types of cruises, particularly very long ones with very long sea passengers, will be the last cruises that we will recommence operation of.
And David, could I just jump in there? Does that then mean, you know, obviously those images that we saw right at the start of this crisis, where cruise lines were not allowed into port and they weren't allowed to come in and you know, disembark passengers, and that was obviously quite concerning, wasn't it? That was one of the things that I think sort of worried people. So that this new framework where you've got these agreements in place mean that that will not happen.
Well, that's absolutely the intention, and a huge amount has changed since those early days and those particular problems. The very fact that we have these that we have this framework, and frameworks of this type are reflected in all the major markets, be it continental Europe and now North America, and of course here in the UK. And the purpose of that is to make sure that we don't have any repetition But an important feature within it is making sure that, not only are there few, if any, cases occurring on board, but when they do, we can get the person off the ship quickly to avoid any spread more widely within the ship, and reach a situation where a large number of people all had to be taken home at once. That is absolutely what all the work that we've done is intended to. So
I think that's crucial in terms of demand, because I think people's nervousness will be around, oh, I don't want to be trapped in case something happens. And I think this is a really important point that agents will be able to communicate to their customers, that that scenario will not happen, because that is what people might have seen on the television. And I think that's really important for agents to take away.
Yeah, and it is also why when you look at individual cruise lines restart plans and the official dates that they have, it's why those dates vary according to the removal of these very, very long cruises with long ocean passengers from programs, until such times as we have got the frameworks operating and that we have experience and that the virus has hopefully moved on.
Yeah, I know Bud wants to come in. Go on, please do, Bud.
Yeah, so just to add to the point that David made in the end, I won't focus on repatriation, but I'll focus on the health aspects. And that is, there's no zero risk scenario here. Just like in our entire society right now, there's no zero risk scenario with COVID. So this is all about identifying the risks and mitigating the risks to a sufficiently safe level where we're providing at least, if not a higher level, and I believe it's a higher level of safety and health for our guests. So as you move from, say, a 2-night cruise to nowhere to the extreme of, say, an extended open ocean passage, the risk profile changes substantially. And as you move along that continuum, you have to mitigate the risks in a different way. So if you're going to run and I don't think the duration of the cruise is as significant as the distance between ports on a particular leg or distance from a port where you have arrangements, as David mentioned. So I don't know so much that it's a 10-day or a 12-day cruise, but how far are you from a place where you really have made those arrangements? And I can tell you in our case, even though we're going to run, we started with 7-day cruises with multiple ports. We intend to run longer cruises with our next ship, but we've done it in a way where we're never very far from one of the ports where we have pre-arrangements already in place should we have a situation where you have COVID on board. Because, I mentioned a couple of the safety nets before. Just like in all of society, there's a risk of COVID entering even the safest of bubbles. That could happen. And if it does, the protocols that we have in place are designed to deal with that and work closely with the authorities to make sure that the cases are managed properly when they do occur and reduce to a very, very minimum the risk that you have these extended exposures, large sorts of cases like you saw in the beginning, where frankly the public health authorities were making some really substantial mistakes in the way that they were handling that. We've all learned from that, and I think it's factored into the way that we plan to operate, at least for the short term.
Now, Lucy, if I could just, the one piece of the jigsaw that from creating the bubble to protecting the bubble to what we're now talking about is rapidly responding to a suspected case, on board a ship. Dave has spoken, Bud have spoken very eloquently about the repatriation, getting the case off the ship. But bear in mind as well, where we are now versus where we are in March is our capability as a cruise line to deal with any suspected cases on board the ship, to isolate suspected cases on board the ship, provide care, but also to contact trace, identify close contacts and isolate as well on board the ship, and do all that side of it as we're talking to authorities about repatriation and also, removing anyone that's suspected of having COVID from the ship. So, what the scenes you saw in March would never happen again, because the science has moved on so much, the preparations moved on so much, and our ability to actually cope on board the ship, as well as the authorities' knowledge of how we are coping and then how we get guests off the ship is in a completely different place than it was back in March.
Okay.
So
all right.
if I just build on that finally. So when we talk about rebuilding consumer confidence, I think that what we've just been talking about is probably the most important point of all that we as cruise lines, and particularly everybody listening as travel agents, can help with, to get that message across that we've just described. And I think the other really important thing, to help confidence is what we haven't touched upon very much, but travel insurance, and making sure that anybody who travels, they have a policy which covers COVID in entirety. So at least they then know that when they've booked, if for any reason they are involving coronavirus and have to cancel before travel, that aspect is absolutely covered, because I think that is also very important for building confidence.
Okay, and on that insurance point, I mean, MSC, you created your own COVID policy, didn't you, that you were encouraging guests to take out? And when I spoke to your CEO on one of these webcasts, he was saying, actually, it's so good and it would give us such peace of mind if everybody took it. So he was actually considering whether to make it compulsory. So what have you done with regards to that?
Presently, it's reflected in the cost of the price that the guest pays. It's just not an option. It's part of the package. It's so good on so many different levels, and it's a reasonable amount of cost that this covers being offered, that it's just something that made sense for us to just integrate into the offering, and it's not optional at this point.
Okay, and so is that something that Royal and Carnival would consider doing as well, gentlemen?
There's different ways to tackle it, Lucy, as well. The cruising with confidence that we have gives someone the chance to cancel, right up to point of departure anyway, 48 hours before departure. So if someone does have, a challenge or exposure to COVID, so there are different ways to cover this. But the point that Bud made and David made is very well made. As part of the prevention measures, we need to make it easy for a guest not to go to the terminal to get onto the ship in the event that they think they've been exposed to COVID or indeed have COVID.
Okay, all right. And let's just pick up on that communication point that David made. He said it's crucial, and you've got lots of people listening to this today, and I'm sure a lot of people will watch it as well on demand. But what should, are you going to provide anything in terms of materials or information? I mean, you talked about Clia simplifying and putting it into a sort of simple language, the elements of the framework, but will you as cruise lines also provide materials to help agents communicate this?
Yeah, let me come in on that, Lucy. One of the things we've actually learned through dealing with government agencies is there's a lot of, and I use the word ignorance very carefully, but so many of the people we're dealing with government have never been on a cruise ship. And you can give them a 6-page document in black and white print and say to them, this is what we're going to do. But it's really hard to think about what you're going to do. One of the great things that Bud and MSC have managed to do is actually visualize it. There's a lot of videos out there. There's lots of social media out there showing how it's actually coming into action. I think we all need to learn from that. And I think be it websites, be it trade tools, be it working in tandem with Clia, we need to make sure that there's a visual representation that's really easy, really simple, so that a guest can actually sit down and look at it and think, right, this is what, not just with what it will look like, but also instructive to them so they understand their role in playing and in creating the bubble and protecting the bubble.
You're talking about creating videos that show what customers are required to do and then what it will be like on board, etc.
Absolutely. It's all part of the communication process that we have to go through before guests get on board the ship.
And will that be done centrally by an organisation like Clia, or will you all do that individually?
I think it'll be both. So I think Clia's role is building confidence to our travel agency partners and to the consumers, and they will base their developments. And Andy can probably come in and talk about it, but some of the great work they are doing around the framework documents and the principles. But bear in mind, each individual cruise line will then do their own risk assessment. Each individual cruise line will look at, what does this mean for this type of ship? What does it mean for this type of itinerary? And it's at that point it will become more bespoke to the cruise line.
Okay. Well, perhaps this is a good point just to invite Andy back in. Andy, did you want to comment on what Clia's got planned? And also, you may well have some more questions. I imagine we've been talking for another 10 minutes or so. Has any other questions come in from our viewers?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Yes, absolutely. This webinar is kind of the beginning of the process of spreading that information around our travel agent community. So there's a new toolkit that will be launched on our website today. We have some more webinars planned. We also have a special half-day event planned where we can really talk in depth about restart and recovery and build on some of the messages that we've heard today as well. So a big thank you to our three panelists today and to you, Lucy. I do have a couple more questions and I'm very conscious of time. Somebody asking, there we go, will cruise lines be looking at the cost of excursions and also the style of excursions that they'll be offering in order to ensure that continued focus on what the customer experience is like in a destination? We can start with that one, and then I think I'd like to go to the question around if the cruise ship has all of this screening as part of that embarkation process. Is it still necessary for guests to wear face coverings across the ship?
Okay, so Bud, maybe you take the first one around costs. I mean, you know, the question was around the cost of shore excursions, but I mean, cost is a whole issue. All these new measures and these guidelines in the framework presumably cost the cruise lines money. Will that impact on what the customer pays, whether it's for a shore excursion or just the cruise price in general?
I think only over time the market will really determine that in the end. At this point, we're not thinking about what it's costing us, and trust me, it's costing a significant amount, but we're not focused on that. We're focused on how can we do this, how can we prove the concepts, how can we provide a guest experience that suits their needs, that's a reasonable business model for us. So as we incorporate their feedback, we'll be looking for ways to expand the variety of offerings, as long as we're still in this very restrictive mode, at least, to where we can find that balance between the proper protections and also what they want and at the right price point. There's a real balance to be had there, but certainly as we get farther into this and are more successful with limited restart, the input from the guests is going to largely determine what's offered in the future.
Okay, all right, thank you, Bud. And I don't know, David, if you want to pick up that second question, which was around, will masks be necessary if people have been screened?
Well, I think as it's already been said, this will never be 100% foolproof. There will always be a minute risk that somebody could bring symptoms on board. So for that reason alone, it will clearly make sense for people to be using face masks in the most public areas of the ship. But it also depends on what is going on in particularly in the UK at the time. What are the levels of risk? It may be that there will be a time where the use of face masks and the requirement to use a face mask has reduced significantly because the virus is weakening. Now, if that happens, of course, we would change the rules. My expectation is at the start, certainly face masks in many parts of the ship will be required, and it will make sense. At the beginning, we really do to make sure that we are managing the risk as tightly as possible.
Okay. I mean, David makes a great point there, Stuart, around how things evolve. You know, we're constantly being told, aren't we, that the science is changing, the virus is evolving, so we're learning all the time. And so to that point, does this framework, will that also evolve alongside what's happening in the world?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I think we're probably close to getting the first addendums coming into the framework already, because if you look at the developments that are going on with the science, with the knowledge of the virus, with how testing has developed since we were back in March, it's just everything is constantly moving. So don't take these framework documents as being as anything other than a line in the sand that we're starting from. And as knowledge improves and as the science improves, as our operations get back up and running, like Bud's has already, and we just learn more about some more efficient ways and safer ways to do things, then you will see that the framework documents will evolve, as we go forward and over time. And in essence, if you look at you know, where we are just now, coming back to the point that David made, you know, on face masks, that's how we are recommending, and we've agreed with the UK government, we're recommending we handle with the virus with the knowledge that we have today. But that will change over time, and you will see recommendations within the framework change over time as well.
All right. Okay. Well, Andy, I think we're coming up to time. So shall I hand back to you to close, or if there's any final questions? Or maybe not. Andy's disappeared. Are you there, Andy?
As if by magic, I'm back. Apologies for that. Conscious of time, so any questions that were put forward this morning, we will respond by email to them with the answers. So thank you to everyone who sent over some questions and comments. Very grateful to those. Thank you to Lucy for moderating so wonderfully this morning as well, and to our panel. So thank you, Stuart, David, and Bud. We will be, as I said, we'll be publishing our toolkit later today, and there'll be details of further events coming up over the next few weeks when we'll go into more detail about the next steps for the UK cruise industry. But from the team at Clia, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.